Hi, my name is Alan Chambers, and I'm the president of Exodus International. Exodus is the world's leading educational, resource, and referral network in the world dealing with homosexuality. We reach out to men and women, families, youth, and churches affected by unwanted homosexuality, meaning not everybody who is gay wants to be. In fact, there are hundreds of thousands of people just like me who have found freedom from homosexuality. Since 1976, Exodus has led the church in helping to be the arms to those affected by sexual brokenness. Since 2001, when I became the president of Exodus, we enhanced our mission to include mobilizing and equipping the church to understand and reach out to men and women struggling with homosexuality. We, more than anything, want to see the healing power of Jesus Christ offered to as many people as possible. Exodus is comprised today of 130 member ministries and therapists located throughout the United States and Canada. Additionally, we are affiliated with the Exodus Global Alliance, which now boasts more than 100 ministries across Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. With the Exodus Global Alliance, we are ministering in churches, communities, and governments, helping people to understand this issue from a redemptive standpoint. The truth is that people need to be educated about the issue of homosexuality. The church needs more understanding today than ever before on how to reach out to men and women, families and communities affected by this great issue. The goal of this resource is to help you understand the issue of homosexuality from a personal perspective. You'll hear a testimony from a man named Mike Inslee who struggled in the church, the son of a pastor who not only dealt with homosexuality personally, but overcame it. Christine Snaringer, who came out of lesbianism over a decade ago. Dr. Julie Harren is going to explain the roots and the causes of homosexuality. And then Jack Harren is going to talk about his son, who is still involved in homosexuality, and how he came to not only love him, but begin to minister to other parents who have children involved in this issue. I pray that this resource will encourage you, not only to reach out with compassion and understanding towards those struggling with unwanted homosexuality, but encourage you and your church to become a ministry of redemption, reaching out to your community and to those in it affected by unwanted homosexuality. Remember, 1 Corinthians 6:9 verse 11 says this, "But such were some of you." The truth is, freedom from homosexuality is possible. I pray that many people in your community will start their journey out of homosexuality with you.
And this is an issue that's very important in my life because several years ago, my brother came and told me that he was gay. And at that time, I had no idea how this could have happened. He had been married for 8 years, and he had grown up for most of his life in a Christian home. And so I just couldn't figure out how he had ended up gay. And his disclosure led my parents and myself to discover 2 organizations that were very helpful, and they provided the information that I'm going to share with you tonight. So the first organization is Exodus International. Their website is exodus.to. The other organization is NARTH, and NARTH is the National Association for the Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. NARTH is a secular organization made up of researchers and therapists dedicated to understanding the nature of same-sex attractions and how to work with people that are struggling with unwanted same-sex attractions. So what I've learned is that there are 2 popular schools of thought on the issue of where homosexuality comes from. But both schools of thought are inaccurate. You see, on the one hand, a lot of people believe that it's biological, that people are just born gay. But you know what? The research does not show that at all. In fact, gay researchers themselves hypothesize that there are many factors that contribute to homosexuality. Now, on the other hand, there are a lot of people that just believe it's a choice, that people choose to be gay. Now, let me say, we do choose our behaviors, but we do not choose our attractions or our desires. So when we say people choose to feel that way, that's completely inaccurate because you see, desires and attractions are like feelings. They come from deep within us. They're not a conscious choice on our part. So where then does it come from? If you're not born that way and if you don't choose to feel that way, where does it come from? Well, I believe that it is a developmental issue. And so I do want to say there are a number of factors that go into human development, and human development is very complex, so I don't want to oversimplify it, but I do want to give you an overview of what would lead to a person to having same-sex attractions. One of the factors is something called gender identity. Now, gender identity is the way a person sees himself in terms of his own gender. So that would be how masculine a boy views himself to be, or how feminine a girl views herself to be. So I want to explain to you how gender identity gets formed in a person's life. I want to explain first how it gets formed in a healthy way, and then I want to go back and explain what happens in the development of gender identity that would lead to same-sex attractions. And I'm going to explain from a male perspective because it's a little bit easier to understand. The female development is a little bit more complex. But I know. But I will go back and describe a few factors that do lead to lesbianism. So first, the male development. When babies are born, all babies, they see themselves as one unit with their mother. So all babies just think that they are one with their mother. Well, eventually, a baby is able to realize that he's not one with his mother, that he's a separate entity. Well, around the age of 1.5 or so, children are also beginning to differentiate the difference between genders. So little boys just starting to recognize girls are girls, boys are boys. I'm a boy, daddy's a boy, mommy's a girl. Well, around the age of 2.5, he now faces a challenge where he must be able to begin separating from his attachment that he has with his mother and attaching himself to his father. And so it is through the relationship that he begins to form with his father that he starts to develop a sense of gender identity. He starts to develop a sense of who he is as a male. And you see, he looks to his father to answer a number of questions for him. He needs a lot of questions answered. He wants to know, what are boys all about? How do they walk? How do they talk? How do they act? Who am I as a boy? Do I have what it takes? Do I measure up? Do you see value in me? And this is all happening at an unconscious level, certainly. It's going on between the ages of about 2.5 to 4, where he's making this break from the mother and he's attaching to the father and he's looking to the father to answer all of those questions. And so the father answers those questions by spending time with his son, by showing interest in his son, specifically showing interest in what his son is interested in. He also answers those questions by verbally affirming his son. I'm so proud of you, you're such a fine young man, you're so brave and strong, you're so special. And he conveys that information through physical touch, both affectionate touch, like hugging and holding, as well as playful touch, like playing rough together, wrestling. It's actually through physical touch and playing together that a boy develops a sense of his own masculine body. So, as he goes on, at around the age of 5 or 6, he now reaches another stage where this is usually a time when kids are starting school. And so around this age, he now looks to male peers to answer the same questions for him that he needed answered from his dad. What are boys all about? How do they walk? How do they talk? How do they act? Who am I as a boy? Do I measure up? Do I have what it takes? Will you accept me? Do I fit in? And so he looks to the other boys to discover who he is in relation to them. And now what he needs from them is he needs to be accepted and included and affirmed, and he needs to spend several years bonding with members of the same sex. You know, if you've ever noticed, when kids are in elementary school, they really don't want much to do with the opposite sex, do they? You know, girls have cooties. Well, that is a God-given stage of development because we cannot become interested in the opposite sex until we first understand our own gender. We have to know who we are and what we're all about before we can be interested in the opposite sex. And so boys have then that steady diet of male connecting or male bonding from the time around 2.5 or so all the way up through puberty. And those 10 or so years give that child a strong sense of who he is as a male, so that when he reaches puberty, he now can begin to become interested in the opposite sex. Now he's got a good sense of who he is, so he then begins to become interested in girls. What are girls all about? They're the intriguing, mysterious other gender. So for the boy that develops same-sex attractions or homosexual attractions, this process that I've just described does not happen. So let me go back and explain what happens in that process of development. But again, I will say human development is very complex, so there are a number of factors that contribute, and I'm just going to give you a basic overview. Usually, for the boy who will develop same-sex attractions, around the age of 2.5 or so, there's something that prevents him from detaching from his mother and attaching himself to his father. Either he doesn't have a father. Now let me say this, I certainly don't in any way want to imply that all boys who grow up without fathers are going to be gay. Clearly we know that is not the case. There are a number of factors that contribute, this is one of them. And if a boy doesn't have a father figure can step in. But for the boy who ends up with same-sex attractions, either he doesn't have a father that he can connect with, or he doesn't have a father that he perceives as safe and welcoming. Now, let me say a word about perceptions. Perceptions are everything. It's not so much what happens to us that matters as how we perceive what happens to us. So, if a boy does not perceive that his father wants that relationship and is safe and welcoming, then he's going to have difficulty connecting with him. You know, the perceptions are influenced by our temperament. So, let me just say a few words about that. Well, an example of how temperament influences perceptions is that a child who's more sensitive is going to take things more personally than a child who's not as sensitive by nature. And so temperament affects how we see things that are happening to us. Usually the temperament of a child who will go on to have same-sex attractions is that he's sensitive, so he's taking things to heart that happen to him. He might be taking things personally even if they're not meant personally. He also, usually the child that ends up with same-sex attractions is usually very smart and very intuitive. He's paying attention to every little detail and he notices everything that happens. And he tends to take those things to heart. And so he also, another factor is, temperamental factor, is sometimes they're more artistic than athletic. And so those are just some of the temperamental factors that go into it. But because of perceptions, he may perceive that his father does not want a relationship with him. Let me say another word about that. I have known fathers that loved their children very much, but somehow just didn't convey it to their children in a way that they could receive and understand. I've known of fathers who were loved their kids, but were really loud and maybe a little bit explosive when they became angry. And to a young 2-year-old boy, a yelling man can look like a monster. And what 2-year-old boy is going to leave the connection with the mother and attach himself to one that he perceives to be like a monster? It's not very likely. I've also known of fathers who really meant well, but thought that the way to help their sons be more of a man would be to tell them how they didn't measure up. Like, in other words, saying things like, quit acting like a sissy. You're acting like such a baby. You're such a little girl. What a mama's boy. Things like that, although maybe well-intended, to a little child, what a child hears is, I don't measure up. I don't have what it takes. And at that time when their sense of gender identity is forming, great damage can be done. And so for any of these reasons, usually around the age of 2.5 or so, the child has difficulty detaching from the mother and attaching to the father. But he wants to attach to the father because God has put it in the heart of every child, that desire for connection, especially with their parents and with the same-sex parent as well. And so that child is craving for that, and he might try to attach to his father, but if he senses rejection, he will try a few times, but he will eventually give up trying because we can only handle so much rejection. And what happens is he will detach from the father. If he has sensed rejection, he will detach from the father internally and what the father represents. They call this defensive detachment. So it's basically like he says, fine, if you don't want me, then I don't want you. And he rejects the father as well as all that the father represents, which is masculinity. Now, deep down inside, he's still craving that. He's still craving for that acceptance and love of his father, but he just can't take the rejection, and so he detaches. So instead of soaking in masculinity at this very important stage, he continues to stay connected with his mother, and he soaks in femininity. And usually, for the boy that ends up with same-sex attractions, there are also other females giving input into his life. Usually there's at least a sister or more, a few sisters, an aunt, a grandmother, other females in his life. And so what happens is he soaks in all this femininity, and he learns all about girls and what girls are all about. But he's craving to learn about boys. He's craving to learn about who he is as a boy. He wants to know about that, but he's not getting that. And so he goes on soaking in femininity, craving masculinity. Well, by the time he is ready to start school, he will often, not always, but typically have a difficult time connecting with other boys, because either he'll feel intimidated by other boys, or he'll just feel more comfortable with girls because that's who he's always been with. Or if he's developed any feminine mannerisms, he might be rejected by the other boys. So he goes to school and he's craving acceptance from them, and he wants relationship with them, but he will typically end up sticking with the girls and having lots of girls for friends and not connecting with the boys, and so those needs for same-sex connection go unmet. So he goes on through elementary school, watching the boys from afar, wishing he could be with them, wishing that they would notice him and accept him and love him, but all the while just getting a stronger sense of femininity and what females are all about. So by the time this child reaches puberty, he certainly isn't going to be interested in the opposite sex. He already knows all about the opposite sex. He's kind of been hanging out with the girls most of his life. What he is curious about and intrigued by are boys. That's what he's still wanting to know, and that's what he's still needing. Let me say this. When God-given needs go unmet, those needs do not go away. Those needs will usually either intensify or take on another form. And so for a boy whose need for same-sex connection has not been met, by the time he reaches puberty, that need has not gone away. That need has intensified, it has grown, it's like a hunger inside of him that is just deepening. And so this is what happens. At puberty, the body is starting to change and he's beginning to develop sexual feelings, and it's almost like the wires get crossed. It's almost like that hunger for male love that God gave him now becomes a sexualized hunger for male love. Now, to him, what it feels like is that he's sexually attracted to these other boys, that he needs a romantic relationship with them. Well, that's not what he needs. What he needs is healthy, non-sexual, emotionally deep relationships with other boys and with his father. But to him, it feels like a sexual need. It feels like a craving for a romantic relationship. And it's very important to realize how strong these feelings are, because when a Christian comes along and says to him, "You're just choosing to feel that way. Shame on you. You should stop." Well, you know what happens? Immediately, the Christian loses credibility, because he says to himself, "You don't know what you're talking about. I have felt this way my whole life. I'm not choosing to feel this way." In fact, most of them will tell you they begged God to take it away. And it doesn't always work that way, because those are legitimate needs that need to be met in right ways. That God doesn't usually just take those needs away. They're intended to be met in right ways through non-sexual male connection. So it's very important to realize that change is possible, and developing healthy relationships with other males is an option, but not to downplay the severity of the situation for the person who's dealing with that. I do want to just say a couple of words about lesbianism. Lesbianism, like I said, is a little bit more complex. I'm going to give you, there are actually a number of things that can contribute to lesbian development. So I'm just going to give you 3 more common forms, and again, there are a lot of others. But so one form of lesbianism starts out just like what I just described with the male version, that the girl is more of a tomboy and she hangs out more with the boys her whole life, but she's craving femininity. She's craving a sense of her own femininity and female input from others. And so for her, it's very similar to that track that I just described with the male development. The second type is a girl who is more feminine, and she probably has had a decent relationship with her mother, but somewhere very early on, maybe even in infancy, there was a break in the relationship with the mother. Now, they may have gone on to have a fine relationship, but that break occurred. Either the baby was hospitalized, or maybe the mother was hospitalized, or maybe the mother suffered depression. But for whatever reason, there was a break in the bonding early on, and even if they went on and they had a fine relationship, there's been a void left. And so for her, lesbianism is like a search for motherly love. And then the third type is a girl who has been hurt by males in her life, either abused or molested. And so for her, lesbianism is protection from further hurt from a male. And then there's one other factor. It's called emotional dependency. And this can actually even occur with two heterosexual women who get involved in a relationship that is unhealthy. Emotional dependency is when two people become overly involved with one another and seek to the other person to meet their deepest emotional needs. It's a very unhealthy thing. And what can happen is, even if two women are heterosexuals, but they get involved in this very unhealthy relationship where there's emotional dependency, that can actually begin to cross boundaries physically, and that can actually become a sexualized relationship. But again, there are many different forms and types of lesbianism, and that's just sort of a basic overview. But I do want to give you an opportunity to hear from some people who have experienced this firsthand and experienced freedom and change in their lives.
Julie has pretty much already told you most of my life story already. Like her, I grew up in a Christian home. My father was actually a Southern Baptist preacher since the time I was 3. And although it looked like a perfect home from the outside, there was no divorce, there was no sexual abuse, no drugs, there was still a lot of dysfunction behind the scenes. My dad was actually really married to his job, as you might say. He was very, very involved as a pastor, and that often left him emotionally exhausted when it came to our family. What was most important, like Julie said, is that I perceived his treatment of me as rejection, and I never felt that masculine love. I didn't feel accepted. I thought he loved everybody else more than me. And my mom also kind of felt this way with him as her husband, so we connected on a much deeper level than we were really supposed to. So as you can see, I was rejecting masculinity and accepting femininity as my identity, as my safe place from a very young age. I began to affect like mom, I talked like her, I became very effeminate as a little child. I know I'm not now, thank the Lord, but believe me, I was very, very effeminate as a little child, and the other kids on the schoolyard picked up on that very quickly. And for a long time, throughout my grade school years, I wore the names sissy, girl, and lots of other horrible ones, as much as people called me by my real name. And it was so incessant and so nonstop that eventually I began to believe maybe it's true, because I can't escape it. And so, like she said, I got into puberty. Those needs, that need for male affection, that feeling of being different and wanting that to not be the way it is, that didn't go away, and I began to realize with horror that I was sexually and emotionally attracted to other boys. And that was very scary for me because, of course, growing up in a Southern Baptist home and church, I knew what God thought about that. And it didn't help that the church did not offer any hope in the area. Every time I heard about homosexuality, it was those gays are so gross, they're going to hell, that's why there is a hell, there's no hope for them. And I felt completely condemned before I could even know what was wrong. So I felt like God rejected me, my parents don't know how to help me, all the other boys treat me like I'm gay, it's hopeless. And when I was finally in high school, I met a girl who told me she was a lesbian, and this was the first person I ever felt comfortable telling about my background. And she introduced me to pornography, to other gay people, and this started a 5-year roller coaster in the gay lifestyle. By 16, I met my first boyfriend. We became sexually active within a week of meeting each other. That relationship did not last very long. I dove into the lifestyle because I was so hungry for that male affection, and even though that relationship didn't succeed, it didn't last, nearly forever. I felt like this, I'm finally getting the love that I've always wanted. At least it's something. Proverbs 27:7 says, to a man who's just eaten a big meal, even honey is no longer desirable, but to someone who's starving, anything bitter is sweet. And that's what gay love was to me. So I went into the lifestyle, and despite my parents' objections, they found out about it. They were horrified. They tried to stop it. They couldn't. I was too clever and devious. But I have had more sexual partners in those 5 years than I can even remember. I was very broken, very desolate, and I got to the point, I remember looking at myself in the mirror after having sex with someone who I didn't even know their name. I don't even think we spoke to each other, but I looked at myself and I said, who are you? I don't know who you are anymore. Is this what your life is? And I was in a place where I would go to hook up with other men, that the Lord met me. And I just had this strong feeling of His presence and Him saying, I don't condemn you. You are you are like that adulterous woman in the story. I will chase your accusers away, but I need you to come with me. I have a better life for you than this. And that did not make me change right on the spot, but it gave me hope and a reason to start pursuing change for my sexuality. There was an Exodus ministry in the city where we were living, and they taught me how my background had affected my sexuality, as Julie has been telling you already. A lot of these things are true that I told you earlier. But I also desperately needed that male affection still. I had to learn that that was a legitimate need. And I needed to have men around me who would love me and touch me and treat me like I was one of the boys, because that's what I needed to know. And there were men who refused to do that in the church. I remember going to the director of men's ministries at one church and telling him what I struggled with. And I told him I needed a mentor, and he said, nobody at this church is going to mentor you. So I went to another church. I had actually given up, and I remember running into somebody, though, in public just a week after that, and he invited me to his church. And the young adult pastor at that church met with me and I told him right away what I struggled with, and he immediately agreed to mentor me and meet me every week. And I needed those peers, I needed those mentors, I needed those men around me who would love me and be patient with me while I didn't become a full-fledged heterosexual right away. They had to bear with me for the long haul through lots of struggles, through lots of ugly confessions of the sin that I was addicted to and I was still dealing with. But God has been faithful. He's been teaching me about himself, about the man that he created me to be, about what masculinity is, about what his vision is for this broken people in our nation. And at the beginning of the year, I'm going to celebrate my 25th birthday and 4 years of freedom from the homosexual lifestyle. So it is possible. God can do anything, and he will do anything for his children. So that's the story of me. Like you heard, I now work at Exodus. If I could choose anywhere to be and anything to be doing, it would be this. So God has blessed me immensely. He is good all the time.
First of all, I grew up in a home where my father was physically and verbally abusive to my mother. And as I looked on at their relationship, I made a very wrong conclusion. I believed that to be feminine was to be weak. I saw my mother as a victim, and I didn't want to be like her. I didn't want to be a victim. And so I hated being a girl because I thought that that was my destiny, was to be a victim like my mom if I embraced my own femininity. And so I had an older brother and a younger sister, and I really looked up to my older brother. I wanted to be like him in every way. I began to play sports at a very young age, and I developed very masculine traits because I was trying to hide who I was. And so growing up, my 3 nicknames were Sir, Son, and Young Man. That's what I was routinely called. My parents got divorced when I was in 5th grade, and I was sent away to live with relatives to another state, my younger sister and I. And that's when I was sexually molested by an older male cousin. And as you can imagine, this didn't help my already warped view of men. You see, by this time, I had only ever seen a man treat a woman as the object of his lust or the victim of his abuse. So it's no wonder that I really didn't want to walk in what it means to be a woman. It seemed that with guys, all they cared about was sex. And so it's really interesting to note that generally speaking, lesbians are trying to protect against further hurt from a man, and that was definitely true in my own case. My first homosexual relationship began when I was 15 years old, and I really have to admit to you that it was exhilarating. It seemed to meet a need in my life because it was the first time I really felt special to somebody. I wasn't special to my parents. My mom had even told me at one time that I was a mistake, that she didn't plan to have me. That was very difficult for me, and I've had to reconcile that even though she didn't plan me, the Lord himself planned me from the beginning of time. That's what my Bible says, and so I'm grateful for that. But at this young age, at 15, lacking affirmation and feeling unsafe in my gender, when a girl in my high school paid attention to me, I was drawn to that because there was a hunger and a craving in my soul for a legitimate need for love from a same-sex parent, for bonding with my mother. And so I know that I was looking for my mother's love in the arms of another woman. I didn't know it then, but I'm able to see that in retrospect. But at the time, it really felt like this is who I am. I didn't know any different, and it was the first time I could feel like I mattered, and I just thought, this is who I am. And so I was just going to go with that. And I will tell you that I just don't want to belabor the whole point of my homosexuality in terms of how long that lasted. I mean, I was involved in that for 6 years, and I'm not going to describe that in detail. I do just want to fast forward to my last relationship, because I want you to understand how somebody who feels so trapped in this and feels like this is their destiny could ever walk away from this. And I tell you, it's not easy. And so I hope that you can hear what I'm going to share, so that maybe someday you can help somebody walk out of this. And for me, in my early 20s, I was in another relationship. At this time, it was with a married woman. And I have to be honest with you that I'm not proud of that fact, that I was a lesbian and a homewrecker. But I will tell you that I am proud of my Savior, Jesus Christ, who still chose to come after me, even though I was those two things. I'm grateful for his grace in my life, that he didn't judge me for that, but that there's no pit too deep, that God is not deeper still. And so at this time, I found myself on a church softball team. And I can't really explain that, really, except that I loved sports. That's the only explanation I have for how a lesbian like myself had ended up playing softball with a bunch of Baptists. And it's not time to pick. I'm not picking on Baptists. I'm very grateful for them. But that was where I found myself. And I will tell you that I had an agenda, and that was, of course, good lesbian that I was, very competitive. I wanted to win, and some of you may know what church sports are all about, and it's quite different than my agenda, and that was just to glorify the Lord and, be a light in a dark world and all these kind of things. And in my own darkness, I never understood any of all that, and it's quite interesting that my teammates really didn't know what to do with me because I was so competitive and really wanted to win, and they would complain about me to my coach. Coach, she's cussing in the outfield. You get the picture. Christian team, my church says, say yes to Jesus, and I'm out there swearing and throwing my glove when something goes wrong. And so they're trying to be light in a dark world to the other teams in the city league. It was a secular league, and here they have this darkness on the outfield. Some of the women, I will tell you, some of the women knew what I was dealing with, because I was still being called sir, son, and young man. I was still very masculine in my appearance and my mannerism, and so they could tell what I was dealing with. However, they didn't come at me regarding my lifestyle, and that's really what I want you to hear. I want you to hear that these women loved me and they prayed for me. I didn't even know it, but I was part of a conspiracy that they were praying for me. Because I really thought I knew what I needed to be happy and to make my life work. And I'm grateful that even though we don't need permission to pray for people and for God to work in their life, and I'm grateful that they were praying for me. And so it was in November of 1989 that I gave my life to Jesus Christ and asked him to be my Savior. And I wish I could tell you that instantly resolved my homosexual orientation, or that God waved a magic wand over me at that time and said, 1, 2, 3, now you're free, go be straight, date and mate. And it didn't... It didn't happen that way. I will tell you that my eternal destiny changed in that moment, but I still had my homosexual orientation very much intact. And so then I began to try to address those things in my life. And I didn't know how not to be gay. I thought this was who I was, but I knew that God didn't want me to be that way. And I was grateful that in God's providence, I found out about Exodus shortly after that, and I began to attend a support group for people like me, Christians who felt trapped by their feelings, who wanted to come out of this. And that's where I understood for the first time the roots of my homosexuality, things I've already shared with you, having an abusive past and the breakdown of the relationship with my mother and my father being abusive. All these things contributed to that. And so as I understood that, it made a huge difference in my life. And even sitting down with a counselor and working through those abuse issues. And then I was able to develop healthy same-sex friendships, non-sexual intimacy with the same sex. And as I did this, my sexual attractions for women naturally diminished. Another wonderful thing that happened at this time was in church, I met a few good men, and I'm not talking about the Marines. I'm talking about men who treated me with dignity and respect, that could free me to embrace my gender for the first time. And so, men, you have a great role to play as well in the life of a woman like myself who could feel trapped and feel that men aren't safe. I found safe men. And so today, homosexuality doesn't cast a shadow on my life. And as the director of an Exodus ministry in Fort Lauderdale called Worthy Creations, it's my great privilege to help other people leave this lifestyle. And so I'm hoping that through this testimony, it will encourage you to be relevant to those around you as a Christian, to be able to reach out in love and look beyond their sin and see their need and their need for a Savior. Thank you.
Good evening. One of those awesome testimonies, I never really cease to be amazed at how when you hear testimonies such as Mike and Christine's, how the scriptures come alive. The Lord tells us in His Word that when we come to Christ, we become new creatures, that old things pass away and all things become new. And I'd like to thank you, Mike and Christine. You did a great job, and it's a privilege to see Christ work in people's lives. Some time ago, I had a similar experience as Christine and Mike. Don't misunderstand, I wasn't gay. I was just the opposite. I really hated anything or anybody that had anything to do with homosexuality. I was born and raised in New York City, and we lived right outside Greenwich Village. And in that era, in the late 40s, homosexuality wasn't accepted by society. As a matter of fact, the homosexual was really persecuted. If they got caught in the act, they got locked up in jail. And I think for my family and my background, I was raised to really be opposed to it. As a matter of fact, as a teenager, we used to go into the village or up to Times Square on weekends just to harass and persecute those who at that time we called queer. And I really developed a disdain and dislike for any one of them. But God has a sense of humor. After I got saved, my wife and I got involved in teaching the evangelism explosion at our church. And one night on visitation, a lady came up to me and she asked me to go visit one of her coworkers. I said, sure. And she handed me the card. She said, oh, by the way, he's gay. I just, much to my shame, just flipped the card back at her. Told her I wasn't about to go see any sissy boy. But God got a hold of me, and I went. I took my team and we went over to Palm Beach. This fellow lived on the second floor of an apartment complex. And as I was going up the stairs, I was praying. I was saying, Lord, don't let this dude be home. I really don't want to see him. I really don't want to be involved or see anybody who's gay or in that lifestyle. And you know what? When I knocked on the door, nobody answered, and I praised God. I said, thank you, Jesus. But I did something I never did before on visitation. I left my card with my phone number. Well, we left that house. We paid a couple more visits. As soon as I got home, the phone rang. And there was this man I went to visit. His name was Patrick, by the way. But Patrick said, hey, Lloyd, thank me so much for coming by, and would you please come back? He really wanted to talk to me. So the following week with my team, we went back to his house. And again, going up the stairs, I'm saying, Lord, what are you doing to me? I can't stand these people. I didn't know what to expect. I expected some guy to open up the door in a skirt and pantyhose, And I was really, really nervous. But in any event, I knocked on the door, and much to my surprise, this clean-cut young guy, about 30 years old, answered the door. Had a big smile on his face. He invited us into his house. We sat down. As soon as he sat down, he said, I heard something on Focus on the Family by Dr. Dobson. I heard that people who have same-sex attractions can change. He said, did you ever hear of anything like that? And I said, yes, I did. I said, as a matter of fact, anything's possible with Christ. The only thing you have to do is come to Him, trust Him as your Savior, lay your burdens before His feet, and He'll answer you, He'll guide you through it. Well, we started to talk about the gospel and what Christ. I gave him a little bit of my background, my testimony, but he kept interrupting me. He kept saying, I hate this lifestyle. At one time, he even had tears in his eyes. He said, I can't stand being gay. I want help. I want to get out of it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know anything about homosexuals, only that I had a tremendous dislike for them. But in any event, I invited him to our church. And fortunately, when he came the next Sunday, I introduced him to a few men. He got involved, and I must say it, and I'm really proud of our church because All the men in the men's group really welcomed him, knowing his background, and made friends with families, and he was really well received. About 2 years into his membership, the pastor put him on staff. He became the pastor's executive assistant. And by the way, he's now married now. He got married about 2 years ago, and he's really comfortable in his sexual identity. But in any event, after meeting this guy, Patrick, and being friends with him for several years, he kept telling me about his background. Similar to what Christine and Mike had to say. His parents rejected him. His sister stopped talking to him. He was really persecuted and disliked in school. He didn't have any friends. He was assaulted on the beach, and his mother put him in a psychiatric clinic. It was horrible. My heart broke for the guy. But I began to understand that homosexuals are indeed human beings, and above all, I began to understand that he was no different than me. In God's eyes, homosexuality was nothing but a sin, but no greater or no less than any other sin. Well, after meeting Patrick, I said God has a sense of humor. My daughter Julie called me up one night and said that she was coming over with my oldest son. They had something to tell me. So they come over to the house, we sat down, and I looked at my son. He was very nervous. As soon as we sat down, he blurted out to my wife and I that he was gay. Well, my wife said, "No, you're not." She said, "Yes, I am. I felt that way my whole life." And my wife looked at him with love and compassion and said, "Well, I don't believe God would create somebody to be something that he disliked." I looked at him, and my emotions were like a roller coaster. I love my son very much. I did then, and I do now. But inside, I was angry. I didn't know whether to pick him up by the throat, throw him out the window. I didn't know whether to cry. I didn't know what to do. I felt a tremendous amount of guilt. But one thing that I really remember very clearly, I was very proud of him in the sense that he displayed a great amount of courage. He knew how I felt about homosexuals. As a matter of fact, one time when he and his brother were young boys, I remember sitting at the table and pointing at the both of them and said, "If any of you ever come home, tell me you're gay, I'll kill you." End the story. But yet here he comes into my house telling me he's gay. Well, we spoke to him, and outwardly I had a very calm demeanor, I guess, and he left, and I went upstairs, and I believe it's the first time my wife ever seen me wet because I just didn't know what to do. I was totally confused. I didn't know what to do. Next morning, I called my friend Patrick, the ex-gay guy. I asked him, "Hey, Patrick, you know, it's ironic. Here my whole life I hated him. Now I'm going to an ex-gay to ask for advice." But anyway, I told him, I said, "What do I do?" He said, well, he knew of a support group down in Fort Lauderdale for parents who had gay loved ones in the lifestyle. So I called up. The woman told me to come on down. They were going to have a meeting the following Tuesday. My wife and I went down there. And on the way down, I kept telling my wife, "What are we doing? I can't believe I'm going to a meeting like this." And there was a couple of times I actually tried to turn around and go back home, but God led me there. And to make matters worse, when we got to the door, the woman had a big smile on her face. She invited me in, and there was about 10 or 12 ladies there. I was the only guy. And I said, "Hey, you know, what do these women know that I'm going through? How can they help me?" And I really wanted to get up and leave and tell these ladies where they could go. But I stayed, and as they went around the circle, each one introduced themselves and gave a little bit of their testimony about their loved one. And after about they got halfway through, I really sensed that each one of these ladies had a dynamic testimony. But more important than that, they really were expressing and showing that they had the peace that passes all understanding that the Apostle Paul talks about in Philippians. I was really impressed. After they gave the testimonies that, we stood up, held hands in a circle, and we prayed. Now, I've known the Lord now for almost 30 years, and I have to say, I've been in, hundreds and hundreds of prayer meetings. But this prayer meeting I'll never forget because it was one of the very few, in all honesty, that I felt the presence of the Holy Spirit. And I can say that God has worked in my life. He's worked in my wife's life. He's given me a peace. As I said before, I love my son. I love him dearly. I love all my children. But he's given me a peace to accept my son because I know the power of Jesus. I know from hearing testimonies like Mike and Christine's that change is possible. There's only two things I'd like to leave with you. Number one, if you have same-sex attractions, the only thing that you can do and you should do is turn it over to the Lord. Establish a deep personal relationship with him. Seek out a support group and get help. Seek out good, healthy, heterosexual friends. If you're a parent and you have somebody who's in a gay lifestyle, 2 steps to take. 1, love them. Love them as Christ loved you before you came to know him as Savior. 2 is pray for them. The next step, pray for them and love them. Never stop praying for them. Find out some people in your church who you can confide in, to tell them about your son or your loved one, your daughter, whatever. Ask them to pray for them. Pray for your child, love them. Pray for your child and love them.
As we get ready to close, I just want to answer the question, how should Christians respond to the issue of homosexuality? And I want to share with you what Joe Dallas has said about that. Joe Dallas is a Christian counselor, author, speaker, and former homosexual. And he says that there are 3 types of homosexuals, each requiring a different response. So the first type is a militant homosexual. The militant homosexuals are gay activists. These are people who are seeking political change. They're looking for taking legislative action. They have a very clear agenda. But I do want to say we sometimes make the mistake of thinking all homosexuals are gay activists. This is a very small percentage of homosexuals that are actually gay activists. So to the gay activist or the militant homosexual, he says we should defend without attacking. In other words, defend what we believe and defend the laws that we believe should be in place, but do so without attacking them. And he gives such a great example of a story that illustrates this. One time, Joe Dallas was scheduled to speak out of Promise Keepers, and a group of gay activists got word that he would be speaking at Promise Keepers, and they said, they made all these threats that they were going to disrupt the event and make sure that it did not succeed because he was an ex-gay and that was a threat to them. So that year, it just so happened that a group of men from the Denver Broncos were helping with security. And so basically what they did is they formed a human link around the stadium, and they did not permit those gay activists to come in and disrupt that Promise Keepers event. Now, they could stand outside and protest, but they just couldn't come in and disrupt the event. That is defending without attacking. In fact, they actually took it a step further. One of those security guys, as the day wore on, went inside the stadium and brought food out to the protesters. They showed God's love. The second group is the moderate homosexual. And moderate homosexuals are just people who want to live their lives. They don't want to change anybody, but they also don't want to be changed. And this is the vast majority of homosexuals. They're just happy to live their lives. To the moderate homosexual, we must model God's love. It is not up to us to go around making sure that homosexuals become heterosexuals. Our main goal as Christians is to make sure that people know Christ. Heterosexual or homosexual, the basic need is that people know Christ. And the way that they get to know him is by being exposed to his love in our lives. And so to the moderate homosexual, we simply ought to model God's love. The third type is a repentant homosexual. And this is someone who is coming into our church or our small group saying, I'm gay, but I don't want to be. Or I have these attractions and I don't want to follow them. Help me. And to them, we must simply walk alongside them and go with them on their journey. It is not an easy process. I've said, and so have some others, that change is possible, but it is a long and very challenging process. It is not an instant thing. And so to those seeking help, we ought to love them, embrace them, cry with them, laugh with them, go along with them for the journey that they're on. So as I close, I really just want to leave each of us with this challenge that we will take God's love. You know, we are vessels. As Christians, we're vessels of God's love. And so I just want to challenge each of us to go out into the places where we live and work and be vessels of God's love. People are hungry for God's love, and it's us as Christians who can allow God's love to pour through us and touch their lives and transform them. It's God then who does the changing work. But what people first need is a relationship with Him, and they're drawn to a relationship with Him when they sense His love in human form.
I hope that this resource has provided you with a deeper understanding of what causes homosexuality and given you a heart for those struggling with it. For more information on the issues concerning overcoming homosexuality, or for more information on Exodus International, please visit us at one of our websites, either www.exodus.to or www.exodusyouth.net.